Welcome back to Reading Bear. Today, we will take a look at some new revenge stories. And if you enjoyed my content, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and post some bear emojis in the comments. Let's go!
The first one is titled, You Saw Me Pulling Out. I was leaving the grocery store after picking up a few items and I was parked with my front end on the inside, facing another empty parking space when suddenly, a woman and her family immediately pulled in with no regards to me going forward to leave. I was upset. I even had to back up now to leave without a rear view camera in my big truck. So, being the petty bastard that I am, I parked far away whilst watching the family go into the store. I seized the moment and took a few empty grocery carts and placed them meticulously in front of her car and the back of her car. I waited and waited until the woman and her family came out the store and noticed that she had a cart carousel surrounding her car. They all had to move it, and that's when I finally drove off and left, laughing of course. Edit, it was a car already parked in front of me prior to going shopping at the store, just for clarification purposes though. The next one is titled, Try to Rip Me Off Hundreds of Dollars? Pay Me Thousands. Last year, I moved out of a house that I had rented for 5 years with no problems. I always had a good relationship with the landlord. There are two relevant bits of background to this story. In the UK where I live, the standard practice when renting a house is to sign a tenancy agreement for a year. At the end of the year, if you want to stay in the house, and the landlord is happy with that, you can just do nothing, and the tenancy will continue automatically until either tenant or landlord gives notice. Alternatively, you can sign a new 1-year tenancy agreement each year, which isn't really necessary, but some landlords want it. My landlord wanted me to sign a new tenancy agreement each year, fine, whatever. So, since I rented the house for 5 years, there were 5 tenancy agreements in total. By law, the landlord was required to protect my security deposit. That meant that she had to put it into a special kind of account within 30 days of receiving it. The tenant then receives login details for the account so that they can check that it's protected and view various info about it. One point of doing this is so that the deposit is held by an independent party who can mediate if the landlord and tenant disagree about any deductions. There is a dispute process that the tenant can request and which is free for the tenant to use. So, I'd been living in the house for almost 5 years, and I gave notice to end the tenancy because I was buying a house. After I'd given notice, the landlord emailed me to ask if I was planning to hire a gardener to ensure that the garden would be returned to the pretty manicured state it was in when I moved in. I thought this was strange because my tenancy agreement explicitly forbade me from doing the sorts of things in the garden that would have been necessary to maintain its original state, e.g. it said that I was not allowed to lop any shrubs or bushes. So, all I'd been doing is cutting the grass and the hedge. Basically, that clause looked like something that a landlord would include if they planned to maintain the yard themselves, except she didn't maintain it while I was living there. In retrospect, it seems that she didn't read her own tenancy agreement properly. I replied to the landlord's email about the yard. I quoted the part of the tenancy agreement that forbade me from doing certain things in the yard and expressed my confusion. I asked her to clarify what her expectations were about the state of the garden, given what it said in the tenancy agreement. She didn't reply, but a couple of weeks later, I received an email from her boyfriend telling me that the landlord was anxious about the garden, and I should ensure that it is returned to the same state as at the start of the tenancy. I replied to him and again asked for clarification, given the wording of the tenancy agreement. He replied saying he'd have the landlord get back to me herself, which she never did. Without any guidance about the garden, I just did my best with it. My boyfriend, who is an experienced gardener, did the work here. I asked him just to do whatever he thought was best. He cut back bushes and cleared loads of stuff. I spent a few $100s on having garden waste removed. I knew that technically I did not need to do that, but wanted to do what I could to keep relations good between me and the landlord. I moved out, the tenancy ended, and after not hearing anything from the landlord for a couple of weeks and not having my deposit back, I emailed the landlord to ask about the deposit. Having ignored my queries about the yard before the end of the tenancy, she chose this moment to announce that she wanted to deduct $520 from my deposit to carry out work on the yard. There followed a really time-wasting back and forth by email in which I pointed out that the terms of the tenancy agreement were incompatible with my being able to maintain the original state of the garden, and she just kept repeating that the garden was not returned to her in its original state. In the end, I suggested that since we couldn't agree about deductions from my deposit, we should use the independent dispute process offered by the company that was holding the deposit. That process needs to be kicked off by the landlord, so I asked her to authorize it. She didn't do that. Instead, she kept wasting my time by sending me emails trying to negotiate an amount to put the yard right, which I wasn't going to entertain. Meanwhile, I could not log into the account where my deposit was being held. I contacted the company, and it turned out that my landlord had accidentally input my email address incorrectly when registering the deposit, which I found very strange because she had emailed me successfully dozens of times throughout the time I was living in the house, so she definitely knew my email address. Without being able to log in, I was unable to officially dispute any deductions she was proposing. There is a window of 3 months after the end of the tenancy when you can dispute any deductions, and after that you either take what the landlord is willing to return or go to court. Apparently, according to Justice for Tenants, who I contacted for advice, it's relatively common for unscrupulous landlords to register their tenants' details incorrectly in an attempt to make it harder for them to recover their deposits in the time frame available for disputes. I had a long back and forth with the deposit company, after which I finally gained access to my deposit account. When I got into it, I looked at the info and noticed that the landlord had not protected my deposit until the day after I gave her notice to end the tenancy. That meant she protected my deposit well after the 30-day deadline by which she was supposed to do it by law. There are penalties for landlords that fail to comply with the laws around tenancy deposits. If they break the rules and the tenant takes them to court, they have to return the full deposit plus between 1 and 3 times the amount of the deposit as compensation. Also, they are not allowed to make any deductions from a tenant's deposit if they haven't complied with the law. I emailed the landlady a bit more firmly than I had previously. Things had been cordial but increasingly frosty. I pointed out that she could not make any deductions from my deposit because she had not complied with the law. She responded by sending me quite a tantrumy, insulting email and authorizing the return of my full deposit. So, yay for the deposit back, but what a witch insulting me when I hadn't done anything wrong. I was upset by the fact that she tried to rip me off and wasted hours and hours of my time trying to sort this out. Not to mention the stress, just seeing an email from her land in my inbox caused my stomach to flip by this point. This is when things started to get a bit more exciting. As I said above, landlords who don't comply with the law around tenancy deposits have to pay between 1 and 3 times the value of the deposit in compensation, plus return the full deposit, if they get taken to court. The documentation from the tenancy deposit scheme proved that she had broken the law. I'd already had my deposit back, but it was clear that if I took her to court, I would receive a minimum of that amount again. Except, of course, I didn't have just the one tenancy agreement with her. As I already mentioned, she had insisted on my signing a new tenancy agreement every year. So, I'd had 5 tenancy agreements in total. I spent a few hours checking the law and going through old emails and documentation, and it turned out that she had failed to protect my deposit correctly in all of the 5 tenancies I had with her. I had a ton of documentation to prove that. That meant that, if I took her to court, I stood to receive a minimum of not 1 but 5 times the amount of my original deposit, over $8,400. It would cost me a couple of $100s to take her to court, and I was 100% willing to do that. In fact, at this point, I was relishing that prospect. In order to take her to court, I first had to send her a letter before action, in which I set out my complaint against her and gave her an opportunity to make an offer to avoid going to court. I had a barrister friend who was helping me out at this point with advice for free. The landlord replied to my letter quite dismissively, basically saying that it was, clearly, just an admin error that caused her to fail to protect my deposit correctly every year for 5 years, lol, and accusing me of being motivated by a windfall. I replied by email, correcting her various mistaken assumptions and repeating the need for her to make an offer in order to avoid court. After a while, she replied and offered me $5,200. I told her that the minimum I would accept was a little over $8,400. I forget the exact figure, since that was the minimum I would stand to get in court. She agreed, with certain conditions attached, perhaps conditions that she thought I might not be able to fulfill, things like sending her copies of all the documentation relating to the deposit for previous year's tenancies, but which I was able to do immediately. When the money landed in my bank account, I emailed her to explain that I would have dropped my complaint against her immediately had she at any point offered a sincere apology, which was true at least up until that final email where she insulted me. I also said that I hoped she would deal more fairly and reasonably with future tenants. She didn't reply. I hope that I will never again be a tenant, but having spent many years being ducked around by shitty landlords and letting agents, it was satisfying to end my renting days with such a satisfying and profitable middle finger. The next one is titled, Postman Now Brings His Mail on a Hand Truck. The year is 1989, I have a manager, let's call him William. William is a drunk of the highest caliber managing a department in a southern state-based insurance company. William likes everyone to follow the rules except for him. He goes to lunch every day and gets rip-roaring drunk and then comes back and makes everyone's life hell. Back in the 80s, businesses used to get these pieces of advertising in the mail with 20 to 30 business reply cards. If you liked a product, you just filled out your name, checked a few boxes and dropped it in the mail, no stamp necessary, and you'd get a catalog in the mail or a salesman would call. I worked in the forms control department. We created and designed forms and labels on computers. As I started growing more and more annoyed with William the drunk, first planned for my eventual departure. I started saving the business reply cards for about a month. Picture a stack 3 inches thick. I gave my 2-week notice and William became a real a-hole. So I used my remaining week to print up about 400 labels with Williams's name, work address and telephone number, which I affixed to about 400 cards, checking whatever boxes would result in a phone call and a catalog or more stuff being sent. On my last day, said my goodbyes and dropped the 400 cards in a mailbox. About 2 weeks later, one of my friends who still worked there called me and said, "Dave, not my real name, what did you do?" I said, "What are you talking about?" "Dave, William is getting a hand truck full of mail every day and he is on fire with rage, because he has to go through all of it to find his actual mail." "Wow, that's unfortunate. Sounds like that is going to cut into his drinking time. Dave, you bastard." "What, who, me?" Less than chuckle, greater than have a nice day and say hello to William for me. The next one is titled, They Bullied an Autistic Kid and Blamed Me. I got a bunch of them expelled and broke up their friend group, and got the guy who did nothing to help me fired. This is a story from my time at my uni LGBT center. There are a lot of characters, but the most important ones are me, Aleph, a guy on the autism spectrum, Brittany, a really mean guy, Charlie, the incompetent director, and Ducky, another catty gay guy. A couple side characters are Olimar, my friend, and Louis, employee at the center. So one day I'm sitting down at the center and Aleph points out a guy walking by. This center had a bunch of student workers, including Brittany, there because they had a weekly meeting soon. One of them made a joke about getting him some water and it became a whole thing. For like half an hour, they were joking and making innuendo while Aleph was asking if they were making fun of him, saying he had no idea what was happening. At this point I had to leave anyway, and sensing that Aleph was in some sort of emotional pain, I said, "Aleph, they're offering you water because they think you're acting thirsty." Big mistake. All the student workers ganged up on me and started yelling at me. Now I was angry, so I stormed off to the library. On my way there, I ran into Charlie and explained what happened, and how I got the shaft. After a couple days, my friend Olimar told me that the incident came up at that meeting. All the student workers threw me under the bus, lying about what happened. So I went back there, saw that Charlie was out, and talked to Louis instead, again explaining what happened and specifically saying the student workers lied about what happened. The student workers weren't punished at all. Instead, they were told at the next meeting that the events of those meetings had to be kept confidential. Since Olimar was the only person there known to be my friend, he was basically known to be the snitch and locked out of the clique. Meanwhile, I was accidentally dropped from a bunch of mailing lists for events at the center, and my therapist mysteriously moved my appointments to the main therapy area, meaning it was harder for me to get sessions booked. I got the message, and stopped going there for the rest of the year. That was my senior year. I graduated, started grad school, and found a much healthier community. Then one night after an inadvisable number of drinks, I went on my college confessions page and wrote out my side, anonymizing all the names, submitted it, and knocked out. I had known that most of the people there had graduated, and Charlie had moved to a job at a different state. I thought it'd get a few comments, maybe some hateful homophobes calling to defund the center, and that'd be it. It turns out Charlie's replacement was competent and actually cared for the students he was in charge of. He spoke to Louis, the only remaining person from that day still working there. Louis gave the student workers' side but named me and Olimar. Olimar had stopped working there, but was in his senior year. The replacement managed to get to talk to Olimar, and reached out to me via email. I gave my side, and got a response with an apology for my treatment there. I wasn't allowed to know what steps would be taken next, but I did notice a few things that happened within the next month. I have no idea what happened to Aleph, he never had a social media. Brittany was expelled from his grad school program. Everything else is the most unbelievable part of this story. He would later go on to reach out to Olimar with a few very horny messages with some weird racist undertones. We read and laughed over them while splitting a bottle of rosé, took screenshots, removed the name, and uploaded them to a meme page. Brittany actually commented on it about how messed up straight people were and how he'd never say anything like that to his LGBTQ+ siblings. Olimar and I both gave laugh reactions to his comment, and I got blocked by him. Charlie accepted a new job at a much smaller college, and stopped posting about how he and his husband were going through the adoption process. He has a cute dog now though, so I guess he's doing okay. Olimar got a letter of recommendation from Charlie's replacement, and put that into getting his first job out of uni. Louis was fired that week. I knew he was using the job as a way to get into a very competitive social work program, but instead moved in with his parents. Last I heard, he just managed to start a different social work program, and I don't know if it was worse, but I do know it's at a smaller, less important college. Finally, the clique itself seems to have been dissolved. None of them comment on each other's posts. They stopped posting to Instagram every Friday about going to the same gay bar, pre-COVID, obviously. The final nail in the coffin was a long, rambling email written to me by Ducky, saying that I should have let the whole thing die down, asking if I fancied myself the Indiana Jones of digging up dead truths. Yes, a direct quote, and yes, the only time any of them came close to owning up. An entire paragraph was devoted to how lonely he was after the clique. They had their own clique name, think like the Ashleys from Recess, dissolved. I forwarded that email to the dean of students. He was in grad school, highlighting the threats of self-harm and the racial slurs. I never heard back from them, and in the 7 years since, I've never heard from or seen any member of that clique. The last one is titled, "I dated a gold digger, and I made her pay her own bill. I live in China. Yesterday I was offered a date with this girl whom I met on Tinder who lives in Shanghai. She wanted to go on a date. I had nothing planned for that day, figured why not. After I met up with her, we walked around, everything was going good. She asked if I had lunch or breakfast. I didn't. She said, I know a place nearby we can eat. After we got to the place, I ordered some shrimp and some orange juice. She got some whiskey, fish, prawns, oysters, crab, and later got some clams, which at this point cost about 3,000 RMB, which equals roughly $400. Every 15 minutes or so she would order 4 more glasses of whiskey, and I think later she ordered some clams on top of that. Altogether she ordered around 15 or so shots of whiskey, and the price came to 6,996 RMB, over $1,000. Before I go on, let me just remind people this is in downtown Shanghai. One slice of pizza cost around 60 RMB. I can get a 12-inch pizza in my small town for that. For anyone who has lived or been to Shanghai, plenty of things here are hella expensive. After that she mentioned wanting to go to a karaoke and dance. I'm frankly appalled that she has the nerve to ask me to do anything else that after, so we go. I'm thinking, I'm going to get this witch, so we arrive. After I say 10 minutes, here comes her friend. She, the gold digger, order a bottle of fine wine, around 3,000 RMB, her friend order some sprinkling wine, 1,100 RMB, and I got some Tsingtao, common beer. I told her, I'll be right back, I need to ask the bartender a question, the karaoke has a bar too. I asked him, I didn't order the bottles, I will not be paying for that, the beer I will. Luckily the guy was understanding of it. Here comes the gold digger, asking what I'm doing. I said, I'm paying for my drink. She said, you going to pay for the 2 bottles? I said, no, I didn't order those. At that moment, I think she knew I've caught on to her scheme and frantically said, here, I'll pay half and you pay half. I did see she put in 2,400 RMB to the bartender. I stood my ground and I said, I'm not paying that. I didn't want that. After literally 5 minutes of telling her that, she went back to her seat. I pay 60 RMB for the beer. I went to be more petty and talk with the girls. She mentioned she doesn't have the money to pay for the drink. I said, not my problem, I didn't want that, I'm not your sugar daddy. Then she said, if you can't pay for that, I have to get another friend and help. In the corner of my eye I look at her friend that came in earlier. She had that awkward look on her face that she didn't have any money on her either. Her last attempt to have me pay was on the promise of sex, which she wasn't going to do even if I did. I said, duck nah, and walked out. At that moment, I pulled out my phone and removed her from my WeChat, it's a messaging app. So for her attempt to have a night on the town at my expense, she had to pay a 4,000 RMB bill, about $600, that she couldn't pay, if she is to be believed, and had to resort to getting another friend to help her out. She is going to have a rough time smoothing that over. Under any circumstance, probably ruin their relationship after that. Or if she is lucky, she is going to pay off the bar by working there for a while. Thanks for listening.